They laughed because they thought they already knew who he was. At 6:47 on a gray Monday morning, the briefing room at South Precinct looked like every other police room in America after a long weekend. Cold fluorescent lights humming overhead, half-empty coffee cups sweating onto scarred tables, a wall map crowded with colored pins, and a line of tired officers leaning back in their chairs like the day had already disappointed them. The room smelled like burnt coffee, damp jackets, printer toner, and the kind of stress nobody talked about out loud. Near the center table, Officer Derek Shaw was halfway through a joke when the door opened and a tall black officer stepped inside, carrying a slim leather folder and a department-issued tablet. He wasn't flashy. No dramatic entrance. No raised voice. Just a steady walk, polished black shoes, a dark navy uniform pressed, so clean it looked untouched by the morning rain, and a face that gave nothing away. A few heads turned. Then Derek leaned back in his chair, glanced at Brandon Cole beside him, and let a slow grin spread across his face. "Well," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Guess they finally sent us an observer." A few officers laughed. Brandon gave a low whistle and added, "Hope he can keep up. This unit doesn't move at desk speed." More laughter. Not loud, not wild, just casual enough to sound normal if you weren't the one standing in the doorway. That was the thing about disrespect in rooms like this. It rarely announced itself. It slipped in wearing a smirk, a shrug, a joke everybody pretended wasn't about race until it was too late to call it anything else. The new officer didn't react. He took in the room the way some men read weather. Quietly, accurately, without needing to say what they saw. He noticed the assignment board hadn't been updated since last shift. He noticed a domestic violence call from Oak Street was still pinned under active patrol instead of priority follow-up. He noticed one of the route overlays on the west side was marked wrong by nearly 2 miles. He noticed all of it in less time than it took Derek to sip his coffee. Then he walked to the far end of the table and sat down his folder with calm, deliberate care. A few of the men watched him, waiting for some awkward introduction, some stiff attempt to prove he belonged. Instead, he opened the folder, glanced once at the deployment sheet, and asked in an even voice, "Who approved this sector split for Zone 3? The question landed strangely in the room, not because it was loud, but because it was precise. Derek let out a dry laugh. "Easy there," he said. "Briefing hasn't even started." The officer looked up, and for the first time, the room had to sit with his eyes. They were steady, unreadable, the eyes of a man who had spent enough years being underestimated to stop treating it like a surprise. "That's exactly why I'm asking now," he said. No anger. No performance. Just control. Somewhere near the back, Sergeant Elena Brooks straightened in her seat. She had seen enough bad mornings to recognize the difference between ego and command, and whatever this was, it wasn't ego. The room went quieter, but not silent. Not yet. Derek still thought he had the advantage. Brandon still wore that careless grin. Around them, radios crackled faintly from the hall, rain tapped against the narrow windows, and the old wall clock kept ticking towards 7 a.m. In 3 minutes, Captain Harold Bennett would walk through that door. In 3 minutes, the laughter in that room would die on its own. And the officer they had mocked without thinking twice would be the one telling every last one of them where to go. Captain Harold Bennett entered without ceremony, rain still darkening the shoulders of his tan command jacket, a yellow legal pad tucked under one arm, and reading glasses in his left hand. He did not raise his voice, but the room changed the second he crossed the threshold. Chairs shifted. Coffee cups lowered. The lazy posture that had filled the room a moment earlier tightened into something closer to discipline. Bennett had that effect on people. He was in his late 50s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that looked carved by too many early mornings and too many bad phone calls. He had spent more than 3 decades in uniform, and he knew the difference between a room that was tired and a room that was rotting from the inside. His eyes moved once across the table, stopping just long enough on Derek Shaw and Brandon Cole to register the fading trace of amusement still sitting on their faces. Then he looked to the man at the far end of the table. "Good," Bennett said. "Lieutenant Reed is already here." The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was worse. It was the kind of silence that arrives when a room realizes it has revealed too much of itself too quickly. Marcus Reed did not move. He stood beside the table, one hand resting lightly near the open folder, his posture straight and unforced, as if he had been expected all along and had no interest in teaching anyone how to behave. Bennett set down his legal pad, placed his glasses on the table, and looked around the room with the weary patience of a man who had stopped being surprised by small failures a long time ago. "Effective this morning," he said, "Lieutenant Marcus Reed will be leading this operational review and assuming command of field deployment for the week." Derek blinked once, then sat up fully. Brandon looked down at his coffee like it might offer him a better version of the last 60 seconds. Near the back, Elena Brooks folded her arms and watched Marcus with a new kind of attention. Bennett continued, "And before anybody asks, yes, this comes directly from downtown. Complaints are up. Response quality is down. Community trust is worse than it has been in 5 years. So if your feelings are hurt by leadership changes, I suggest you put those feelings in a drawer and get through your shift." Nobody said a word. The rain tapped steadily against the narrow window panes. A radio crackled in the hallway, then went quiet again. Bennett turned to Marcus with a short nod. "Lieutenant, the room is yours." Marcus let a beat pass before speaking, not for effect, but because he wanted the room listening before he gave it anything worth hearing. "Thank you, Captain." His voice was low, even controlled. Not cold, not warm, just measured in a way that made every word land cleanly. He reached for the deployment sheet and turned it so the table could see. "Before we discuss assignments, we need to correct this west side coverage split. As it stands, if a priority call comes in from Oak Street or the Franklin Apartments, your nearest available unit is almost 7 minutes out." He tapped the page once with a finger. "That is too long." A few officers exchanged glances. The laughter from earlier now felt childish, distant, expensive. Marcus continued, "Whoever built this map assumed traffic patterns from overnight hours. That does not work at 7 in the morning when school zones are active, buses are loading, and commuters are backing up along Grand Avenue." He looked up, not singling anyone out, not yet. One bad assumption in this room turns into a delayed response out there. And delayed response is how small problems become permanent ones. Elena gave the faintest nod. Even Bennett, already familiar with Marcus's record, seemed satisfied by how quickly the room had shifted from attitude to attention. Derek opened his mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it. Marcus saw that too. He saw the pride, the discomfort, the instinct to challenge authority only after realizing authority had been present from the beginning. He had seen men like Derek before. Departments were full of them. Officers who confused confidence with competence. Men who thought command came from familiarity, from volume, from knowing how to control a room by making someone else smaller inside it. Marcus had spent most of his career proving otherwise. He looked down once more at the board, then back at the officers seated in front of him. "Let us start over," he said. "This time, let us do it like the public we serve actually matters." The room did not relax after that. If anything, it became more alert, the way people sit when they realize the meeting is no longer routine and every careless habit is about to be noticed. Marcus Reed stepped to the whiteboard at the front of the briefing room and picked up a dry erase marker with the ease of someone who had spent years walking into tense spaces without needing to announce control. He drew a clean line through the old sector split, then circled 3 blocks on the west side of the map where early traffic always backed up after 7 o'clock. "School drop-off starts here, here, and here," he said, marking each point with calm precision. "You also have a city bus choke point on Franklin and a construction lane closure on Grant that turns a 4-minute drive into 9 if you make the wrong turn. That means your current setup leaves the apartment corridor uncovered at the exact hour calls start rising." No one interrupted him, not even Derek Shaw. There was something deeply unsettling about watching a man you had just dismissed begin to understand your district better than the officers who had worked it all month. Marcus flipped to the next page in the folder and laid out 3 printed incident reports side by side. "These came in over the last 10 days, he said. "Noise complaint, welfare check, domestic disturbance, 3 different call types. Same neighborhood, same outcome." His eyes moved across the room. Delayed arrival, escalated tension, preventable mistrust. He did not say the word failure. He did not need to. It was sitting in the room already, heavy as wet wool. Sergeant Elena Brooks leaned forward, elbows on the table now, her expression sharpened by professional respect. She had spent long enough in uniform to know when someone was grandstanding and when someone was simply prepared. Marcus was not trying to impress anyone. That almost made it worse for the men who had laughed at him. He was just doing the job, and doing it better than they expected. Captain Bennett stood off to the side, silent, letting the room learn what it needed to learn. Marcus continued, "This is not only a deployment problem. It is a credibility problem. Every time officers arrive late, confused, or already irritated because they have been sent across the district on bad routing, the public pays for that confusion first." He capped the marker, then looked directly at the officers nearest the center table. "And the public remembers." That sentence seemed to settle over the room more heavily than everything else. Maybe because it was true. Maybe because every officer in there had felt the shift in how people looked at them lately. More phones held up on sidewalks. More guarded faces behind apartment doors. More mothers pulling children a little closer when patrol cars rolled by. Marcus was not inventing a problem. He was naming one they had all been living with. Derek cleared his throat at last, not loud, but enough to make the room glance his way. "With respect, Lieutenant," he said, the title sounding new and uncomfortable in his mouth. "We do not always get the luxury of perfect coverage." Marcus turned toward him without hurry. "You are right," he said. "We do not." His voice stayed level, but the air tightened anyway. "That is why discipline matters before the call comes in, not after." Derek said nothing. Brandon looked fixedly at the table. Somewhere in the hallway, a printer started up with a mechanical whine, then stopped. Rainwater ticked from someone's jacket onto the tile near the door. The whole building seemed to pause around that one exchange. Marcus gathered the reports and squared them neatly. "You cannot control every call," he said. "You cannot control traffic, weather, or what people bring with them when they dial 911. But you can control whether you walk into this room prepared. You can control whether your assumptions make the day harder for the people beside you. And you can control whether this badge means service or just status." That line hit harder than any raised voice could have. Elena looked down for a moment, then back up. Bennett folded his arms. Around the table, the officers sat quieter than before, not because they were being scolded, but because something more difficult was happening. They were being measured. And for the first time that morning, Marcus Reed was no longer just the man at the front of the room. He was the standard everyone else had just been compared against. For a moment, no one moved. The briefing room held that rare kind of silence that did not feel peaceful so much as exposed, as if the walls themselves had heard too much and were now waiting to see who would try to recover first. Marcus Reed let the quiet do its work. He had learned a long time ago that in rooms built on ego, silence could be more revealing than argument. Men who talked too much usually did. It because they were afraid of what a still room might say about them. Derek Shaw was the first to shift in his seat. He reached for his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it down with more force than necessary. "So what now?" he asked, trying for casual and missing it by a mile. "We spend the morning pretending a map is the reason everybody hates cops." A few heads turned, not with the easy amusement from before, but with the wary attention people gave when they sensed someone stepping onto thin ice. Marcus looked at him without blinking. "No," he said. "We spend the morning being honest about why trust breaks down faster than most departments admit." Derek gave a tight laugh, the kind that carried more resentment than humor. "Trust breaks down because people lie. Because they record half a story, post it online, and let the whole city decide what happened before the paperwork is even filed." Marcus nodded once, as if he had expected that answer. "Sometimes that happens," he said. "And sometimes people tell the truth, and no one in uniform wants to hear it." The words were not loud, but they struck the center of the room all the same. Brandon Cole looked from Derek to Marcus and then away, like a man realizing too late that the joke had grown into something he did not know how to control. Near the back wall, Elena Brooks stayed still, but there was no mistaking the change in her face now. She was no longer watching a new lieutenant handle a difficult room. She was watching a test of character unfold in real time. Derek folded his arms. "You walk in here for 5 minutes, and suddenly you know what this unit has been dealing with." The challenge was sharper now, stripped of the false ease from earlier. Around the room, chairs creaked softly as officers adjusted in place, waiting to see whether Marcus would snap, lecture, or take the bait Derek was laying down for him. But Marcus did none of those things. He rested one hand lightly on the table and said, I know enough to see when a room is more committed to defending itself than improving. That landed harder than Derek expected. It showed in the quick tightening of his jaw, in the way he looked around for support and found mostly lowered eyes. Because that was the truth none of them wanted said plainly. Not in a precinct like this. Not in a week like this. South Precinct had been under pressure for months. Complaint numbers were rising. Response times were slipping. Community meetings had turned colder, heavier, more crowded. Every officer in that room knew it. Even the ones who still spoke about it like it was somebody else's problem. Marcus had not brought that truth with him. He had only walked in carrying the nerve to say it out loud. Captain Bennett finally stepped forward from the wall, not to interrupt, but to make his presence felt again. Lieutenant Reed is not here to make friends with your bad habits, he said. He is here because this unit needs correction, and frankly, it needed it before today. No one argued with the captain. They were too busy absorbing the fact that the man they had laughed at less than 20 minutes earlier had not raised his voice once, had not humiliated anyone back, and yet somehow had taken control of the room more completely than shouting ever could. Marcus picked up the revised deployment chart and slid copies down the table. Here is what happens next, he said. We fixed the west side coverage. We tightened school corridor response. We stopped treating preparation like a suggestion. And before anyone rolls out this morning, we're going to talk about what respect looks like inside this building, because how officers talk in this room always becomes how they act out there. This time, nobody laughed. The old wall clock above the map clicked to 7:12, and just then the radio on the side counter cracked to life with the sharp burst of dispatch traffic. Every head in the room turned at once. The day outside had just started moving, and whatever happened next, it was going to happen under Marcus Reed's command. The radio traffic came through in clipped bursts, the kind that sharpened every posture in the room without anyone needing to be told to pay attention. A domestic disturbance had just been upgraded from a noise complaint to a priority response on Oak Street. Third floor, children possibly inside, caller disconnected before. Dispatch could get more details. For half a second the room froze between habit and command, officers glancing at one another as if the old deployment map still had a claim on the morning. Then Marcus Reed stepped forward, one hand already on the board, the other reaching for the marker he had capped only moments earlier. Brooks, you take the nearest car and approach from Franklin, not Grant, he said, drawing a quick arrow across the map. School traffic is stacking up on Grant already, and you will lose at least 4 minutes at the light. Elena was on her feet before he finished the sentence. Yes, sir. Marcus turned slightly. Cole, you and Ramirez back her from the south stairwell entrance. No crowding the hallway. No talking over each other on scene. One voice, one contact officer, one backup. Brandon nodded, the grin from earlier nowhere in sight now. Marcus did not even glance at Derek at first. He adjusted one more pin on the board, then said, Shaw, you stay secondary unless Brooks requests otherwise. You will keep your body camera active from arrival to clear. No exceptions. The words were clean, direct, impossible to misread. Derek opened his mouth, perhaps ready with some protest about seniority or field instinct. But Captain Bennett was standing close enough now that the protest died before it reached daylight. You heard the lieutenant, Bennett said. Move. Chairs scraped back. Boots crossed tile. The room broke open all at once, officers grabbing radios, jackets, duty notebooks, coffee abandoned where it sat. Yet even in that rush, there was something different in the air. The disorder from earlier had given way to structure, and structure had a way of revealing who had been pretending competence and who had actually built it. Marcus watched them go with the focused calm of a man who understood that leadership was not a speech and it was not a title. It was a sequence of decisions made under pressure while other people still had time to panic. As Elena reached the door, Marcus stopped her with one last instruction. If the children are inside, slow the scene down before you do anything else. Fear spreads faster than facts in apartments like that. She gave him one hard, professional nod, the kind officers reserved for people they trusted to carry weight. Then she was gone. The room emptied in less than 20 seconds, leaving behind only Marcus, Bennett, Derek, and the low mechanical hum of the old ventilation system above them. Rain streaked the narrow window near the evidence cabinet, and somewhere deeper in the building a phone rang twice before someone picked it up. Derek stood still, jaw set. keys clipped to his belt, making a faint metallic sound each time he shifted his weight. He did not look angry so much as unsettled, like a man discovering that the ground under his feet was not nearly as solid as he had imagined. Marcus turned to the board again and began making notes for incoming units, his handwriting sharp and readable, no wasted movement. Derek finally spoke. "You think keeping me second car is going to teach me something?" The question carried that same old edge, but there was less certainty in it now. Marcus did not look up right away. "No," he said. "I think the public deserves a scene handled by officers who understand control is not the same thing as pressure." Bennett exhaled slowly through his nose. Not quite a sigh, not quite approval, but something close to both. Derek looked away first. That mattered. In police culture, little things always mattered. Who could hold eye contact? Who could follow direction without making it personal? Who could accept correction without turning it into a grievance? Outside, through the rain-blurred glass, a patrol cruiser pulled hard out of the lot and turned toward Oak Street, lights reflecting in wet pavement like broken ribbons of red and blue. Marcus checked the wall clock. 7:14 in the morning. Less than half an hour earlier, this same room had treated him like a punchline. Now every car leaving that lot was moving according to his plan, and somewhere across the district, a family he had never met stood a better chance of being met with calm instead of confusion. That was the thing no one in the room had understood when he first walked in. Leadership was not about making people feel small. It was about making sure the people, depending on you, never had to pay for your pride. By 7:21, the first update came over the radio, and it changed the atmosphere inside South Precinct more than any speech could have. Elena Brooks's voice cut through the static, steady and controlled. Scene is contained. 2 adults separated. 2 children located safe in the back bedroom. No injuries reported. We are slowing it down. Marcus Reed did not smile, but something in his posture eased by half an inch. Captain Bennett, standing near the side counter with both hands resting on the edge, looked toward the rain-striped window and gave the smallest nod, as though the result confirmed something he had already known. Derek Shaw heard it too. Everyone in the building did. The difference was that some officers heard a routine field update, while Derek heard proof that the plan he had silently questioned had worked exactly the way Marcus said it would. South of Oak Street, the school traffic had started backing up just as predicted, yellow buses locking one lane at a time, while parents in sport utility vehicles squeezed too close to the curb in a rush to beat the bell. If Elena had taken Grant, she would have hit the bottleneck and lost precious minutes before even stepping onto the property. But she had not taken Grant. She had taken Franklin, just like Marcus told her, and now the call that could have spiraled into chaos had been met with structure instead of delay. Marcus moved to the dispatch monitor and scanned the update log with the kind of attention that made even quiet work look disciplined. "Cole is in position," he said, mostly to Bennett, though Derek could hear every word. "Ramirez is holding the south stairwell. Brooks has primary contact." Good. There was no victory in his tone, no trace of payback. That almost made it harder for Derek to stand there. If Marcus had gloated, Derek could have hated him cleanly and kept his pride intact. But Marcus did not seem interested in humiliating anyone. He was interested in the work, and the work was going well. That left Derek with nowhere comfortable to put his embarrassment. He shifted near the door, the leather of his duty belt creaking softly, as he folded and unfolded his arms. "One call does not prove anything," he muttered, not quite to Marcus, not quite to himself. Bennett heard it anyway. "No," the captain said, turning just enough to let the sentence land where it belonged. "But it proves more than laughing in a briefing room." Derek said nothing. The words hung there between them, simple and devastating. Across the hall, an officer hurried past carrying a stack of intake forms, and somewhere in the report room a copier started churning out pages with a dry mechanical rhythm. The precinct had gone back to doing what precincts always did on a wet weekday morning: answering calls, filing paperwork, pushing through the ordinary machinery of public service. But inside the briefing room, something less ordinary was taking shape. The hierarchy everyone thought they understood had cracked open, and what lay underneath was not just rank. It was character. Marcus picked up the revised deployment sheet again, reviewing the next wave of assignments for the 8 o'clock hour, when commuter traffic would thin and nuisance calls would give way to school corridor complaints, retail theft reports, and wellness checks from seniors who lived alone. He marked 2 streets, reassigned 1 patrol pair, and then finally looked toward Derek. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with the same calm attention he had brought into the room from the start. "You know this district well," Marcus said. Derek looked up, caught off guard by being addressed without accusation. "I have worked it for 6 years. "Then use that knowledge better," Marcus replied. "Not to protect your ego, to protect the people on the other side of the call." It was such a quiet sentence, but it carried more weight than any dressing down ever could. Derek stared at him for a long moment, and somewhere behind the defensiveness, something older and harder to admit began pressing at the edges of his expression. Not shame exactly, something closer to recognition. Recognition that he had spent years confusing confidence with worth, volume with authority, familiarity with wisdom. Bennett watched the exchange without interfering. He understood what was happening. Discipline could be ordered. Respect could not. Respect had to arrive the hard way, through competence, restraint, and the kind of steady leadership that made other people safer even when they did not deserve your grace. The radio crackled again. Brooks was requesting a caseworker follow-up for the children and notifying dispatch that the adults on scene had calmed enough for statements to be taken separately. Marcus wrote one quick note in the margin of the board and said, almost to the room itself, "That is what a good response sounds like." Rain continued sliding down the window in thin silver lines. The wall clock ticked towards 7:25, and in the quiet space between one successful call and the next, Derek Shaw began to understand that this morning was no longer about who had laughed first. It was about who had been fit to lead all along. At 7:32, the morning settled into that deceptive rhythm police buildings often wore when too much was happening at once. Phones rang, printers coughed out reports, wet boots crossed tile, and somewhere near the front desk a complainant was trying to explain a parking dispute in a voice already frayed by the day. Inside the briefing room, Marcus Reed remained at the board, adjusting deployment notes for the next hour while Captain Bennett stepped out to take a call from downtown. The room was quieter now, stripped of the early swagger that had filled it before sunrise. Only Derek Shaw remained near the doorway, unwilling to leave and too proud to admit he no longer knew what to say. On the dispatch monitor, call statuses shifted line by line in soft blue light. Oak Street remained under control. A welfare check on the east side had just cleared. A shoplifting complaint near a pharmacy on Madison was pending review. Ordinary calls, ordinary strain, the kind of daily weight that either trained officers into discipline or revealed the cracks they had spent years covering with attitude. Marcus set the marker down and opened a new incident summary on his tablet. Without looking up, he said, "Do you know what gets departments in trouble faster than a bad arrest or a delayed response?" Derek frowned. "What?" Marcus turned then, not with theatrical force, but with the directness of a man asking a question that mattered. "Contempt," he said. "The public can forgive mistakes faster than it can forgive contempt. Communities know the difference. So do officers. The only people who pretend not to are the ones who benefit from the confusion." Derek held his gaze longer this time. There was no smirk left in him now, no easy fallback into sarcasm. Just the uncomfortable stillness of someone hearing truth from a person he had already chosen to underestimate. "You think that is what this was?" Derek asked at last. "Contempt." Marcus did not rush the answer. Rain traced slow silver lines down the window beside the old evidence cabinet, and in the hall outside, 2 patrol officers passed by speaking in low voices about a collision on River Avenue. Everything ordinary continued. Yet inside that room, the question hung heavier than the radio traffic. "I think," Marcus said, "that mockery is what people use when they want to put someone in their place without saying the quiet part out loud." Derek looked away first, toward the board, toward the table, toward anywhere his own reflection was not waiting for him. His face had changed in the last half hour. The arrogance had not disappeared completely, but it had lost its ease. It now looked like effort. "You walked in, and I made assumptions," he said, the words stiff, as though even speaking them cost him something. "About where you came from, why you were here, what you had earned." Marcus nodded once. That is usually how it starts. No lecture followed. No sharp rebuke. Marcus had no interest in turning remorse into spectacle. He had seen enough of that in public statements and internal memos, enough apologies shaped for paperwork instead of growth. What mattered to him was whether anything real would happen next. Derek rubbed a hand across his jaw and let out a breath that sounded more tired than angry. You know what the worst part is? He asked quietly. I did not even think of it as race in the moment. It just felt normal. That sentence changed the room more than either of them expected. Because there it was. At last, not polished, not pretty, but honest. The most dangerous habits were the ones that felt ordinary to the people carrying them. Marcus studied him for a beat, then said, that is why departments fail people for years at a time. Not always because every officer wakes up determined to do wrong, but because too many get comfortable with disrespect and start calling it instinct. Derek swallowed hard, eyes fixed now on the edge of the table where his empty coffee cup still sat from earlier, a small forgotten thing that suddenly seemed to belong to another version of the morning. So what happens now? He asked. Marcus picked up the deployment sheet and handed him a copy. Now you learn the district again, he said. Not as territory to control, as people to serve. You review body camera policy before your next shift. You ride second when I tell you to ride second. You listen more than you speak. And you stop confusing being used to power with being worthy of it. Derek took the paper without argument. That, more than anything, told the truth of where they stood. Captain Bennett returned a moment later and paused just inside the door, reading the room with one practiced glance. He saw Derek holding the deployment sheet. He saw Marcus already moving on to the next task. He said nothing. He did not need to. Some corrections happened on paper. Others happened in silence. When a man realized that the person he laughed at had just offered him something far harder than humiliation, a chance to become better than he had been 15 minutes earlier. At 7:48, the rain had eased to a thin mist that turned the precinct parking lot into a wash of gray reflections and blurred headlights. The building itself seemed to exhale after the tension of the first calls, settling into the hard, unglamorous work that filled every police station once the morning rush had fully begun. Reports moved from hand to hand. Radios rose and fell with updates from corners of the district most people would never think about unless something went wrong there. Inside the briefing room, Marcus Reed had already reorganized the next 2 patrol rotations, flagged 3 pending follow. UPS, and sent a note to dispatch requesting a revised school corridor overlay for the afternoon shift. He moved with the steady efficiency of a man who did not waste energy proving he belonged because he had already decided that belonging was not the point. Doing the job right was. Captain Bennett stood near the door reviewing call summaries on his phone when Elena Brooks stepped back into the room, rain-speckled and focused, her patrol jacket half unzipped and her notebook tucked under one arm. Oak Street is stabilized, she said. Caseworker is en route. Kids are with an aunt downstairs. No further escalation. Marcus nodded once. Good work. Elena glanced toward the board, saw the revised assignments already posted, and then let her gaze settle briefly on Derek Shaw, who was still in the room but standing differently now, with less ownership and more awareness. Lieutenant, she said, your route change made the difference. If we had come in from Grant, we would have been stuck behind school traffic and delivery trucks for who knows how long. Bennett looked up from his phone. That is now 2 confirmations this morning, he said. One from dispatch timing and one from field. Derek did not speak, but the message reached him all the same. The plan had not merely sounded good in a room. It had worked where it mattered. That was what made the lesson impossible to shrug off. In police work, theory could be debated. Results could not. Marcus gathered the loose papers on the table into a clean stack and asked Elena for the short version of the scene, not because he doubted the report, but because good commanders listened twice when families and children were involved. Elena gave it to him plainly. The apartment had been crowded. Emotions were running high. Neighbors were already in the hallway by the time her unit arrived, and the difference between a bad morning and a lasting wound had come down to tone, timing, and the decision not to let too many voices flood the space at once. One contact officer helped, she said. Keeping the hall clear helped more. People settle faster when they are not being surrounded. Marcus leaned lightly against the table. Exactly. Control without crowding. Presence without pressure. Elena gave a small nod, the kind that said she was not just hearing policy language. She had seen it work. Bennett slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket and looked around the room. This is what I have been trying to get through to this unit for months, he said. Professionalism is not optics. It is not public relations. It is not some speech you give after a bad headline. It is operational. It changes outcomes. The words hung there with a weight that belonged to experience. Not theory. Experience. Derek stared at the deployment sheet in his hand, as if he were reading more than addresses and route notes. For the first time all morning, he seemed genuinely quiet, not because he had run out of things to say, but because he had started hearing too much. Marcus saw it, but he did not press. Growth that came from humiliation rarely lasted. Growth that came from consequence sometimes did. The radio burst to life again with a call for a possible welfare check on Madison, an elderly resident who had missed a pharmacy pickup and was not answering her landline. Marcus responded immediately, pairing Brooks with a newer officer who needed calm field experience, and sending Derek with Ramirez to cover the perimeter route in case medical support was needed. Derek looked up, surprised to be assigned at all after the morning he had created for himself. Marcus met his eyes and said, "Do the work right." Nothing more. No reminder. No sting attached. Just expectation. Strange how much harder that could hit than anger. Derek gave one short nod and reached for his radio. Elena headed for the door again, boots tapping against the tile with purposeful speed. Bennett moved aside to let them pass, then turned back toward Marcus after they were gone. "You could have buried him in front of everyone," the captain said quietly. Marcus looked down at the board where addresses, names, and patrol sectors sat arranged in a pattern of responsibility that would outlast any single man's pride. "That would have taught him fear," he said. "I need him to learn discipline." Bennett studied him for a moment, then gave a slow, thoughtful nod. Outside, a patrol unit rolled through the mist and turned toward Madison Avenue, its tires hissing against wet pavement. Inside, the wall clock edged toward 8 o'clock. The morning had begun with mockery, assumptions, and the lazy confidence of men who believed power belonged to whoever spoke first and loudest. But now the room held something different, something harder won and far more valuable. Competence had changed the atmosphere. Restraint had changed the hierarchy. And in a precinct that had forgotten too often what respect was supposed to look like, Marcus Reed was not just running the shift anymore. He was quietly resetting the standard for everyone who still wore the badge. By 8:12, the rain had thinned to a pale haze over the city, the kind that left the streets slick and the air smelling faintly of wet concrete, exhaust, and spring leaves pressed under tires. South Precinct had fully crossed into the second phase of the morning now, when the first burst of urgency gave way to paperwork, follow-ups, and the quiet accounting that told the real story of a shift. Marcus Reed stood at the front table finishing the last round of assignment notes while dispatch updates scrolled across the monitor in soft blue lines. The welfare check on Madison had cleared safely. The elderly resident had simply left her hearing aid on the kitchen counter and missed both the pharmacy call and the landline. Brooks had handled it with patience. Ramirez had stayed steady. Derek Shaw had followed direction, held perimeter, kept his camera on, and said very little. It was not redemption. It was something smaller, more honest, and far more useful. It was the beginning of correction. One by one, officers filtered back through the briefing room to swap batteries, update logs, and catch the next piece of the day before heading out again. The difference in how they moved around Marcus was impossible to miss now. No more side glances. No more smirks dressed up as humor. They spoke to him directly. They listened when he answered. Even the room itself seemed altered, as if the cheap fluorescent lights had not changed at all, and yet somehow showed everything more clearly. Captain Bennett stood near the wall map with a printed response summary in hand, reading over the morning numbers with the quiet concentration of a man who had waited a long time to see competence restore order instead of ego disrupting it. "Best first 2 hours we have had in weeks," he said at last. Not loudly, just clearly enough for the room to hear. Elena Brooks zipped her jacket and reached for a fresh incident packet. "Because the room was led before the streets were," she said. It was a simple sentence, but it landed with unusual force because everyone there knew how true it was. Police work did not begin with sirens. It began with the culture inside rooms like this one, with the comments officers made when they thought no one important was listening, with the assumptions they carried into a shift, with the way they treated one another before they ever faced the public. Derek stood at the edge of the table, holding a clipboard he had not yet signed. He looked tired now, not from running calls, but from having to see himself more clearly than he had expected when the day began. He watched Marcus for a long moment, then said, "Lieutenant." The room did not go silent, but it did pay attention. Derek swallowed once, jaw tight with the effort of saying something that did not come naturally to him. I was out of line this morning. No excuses followed. No attempt to soften it into misunderstanding or humor. Just the truth, plain and exposed. Marcus looked at him the same way he had all morning, steady, unreadable, unwilling to turn another man's honesty into a performance. Derek went on. I made assumptions before you said a word. I treated you like you had to prove something to me. You did not. He glanced down, then back up. That was on me. Somewhere behind him, a printer started humming again. A radio chirped near the hallway. Life in the precinct kept moving, because that was what buildings like this always did. But within that ordinary motion, something uncommon had happened. A man who had used mockery as armor was standing in the same room where he had worn it, and setting it down without being forced. Marcus nodded once. Then do better. With the next person, he said. That is how this matters. Derek blinked, as if he had expected punishment wrapped in words, and was not quite sure what to do with accountability handed back to him instead. Elena glanced toward Marcus with the faintest trace of respect in her expression, the kind earned when leadership chooses discipline over humiliation and principle over pride. Captain Bennett folded the response summary in half and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Listen carefully, he said to the room. Every problem this department faces gets worse when officers think respect is optional. Not respect for rank. Respect for people. For your partners. For the public. For the person walking into a room that has already decided who they are before they speak. Nobody looked away from that sentence. They could not. It named too much too directly. Marcus gathered the final deployment sheets and handed them out, one by one, his movements calm, efficient, final. The shift was not over. The district was still full of calls, worries, weather, traffic, ordinary need. Somewhere a mother would dial for help. Somewhere an old man would wait at a window hoping the next knock brought patience instead of judgment. Somewhere a teenager would look at a patrol car and decide, based on one small interaction, whether the badge meant safety or threat. Marcus knew that. He had always known that. That was why he never chased authority the way other men did. He understood that command was not what happened when a room obeyed you. Command was what happened when your discipline made other people safer. He looked once around the briefing room, at the officers gathering their gear, at the wet footprints fading on the tile, at the wall map that had seen too many bad habits mistaken for tradition. Then he spoke in the same quiet voice that had changed the entire morning. The fastest way to lose the right to lead is to treat another human being like they matter less than you do. The room held that line in silence. Outside, a patrol cruiser pulled from the lot and merged into the wet city streets under a sky finally beginning to brighten. Inside, no one laughed. And that, more than anything, told the truth about what had changed.